In this case, it's the story of King David, who was once a young shepherd, a tender of sheep, and who was a wonderful musician. And he slays a giant, and now he's the powerful king of Israel. And he is subject to all the temptations of power. So let us open our hearts and minds to this reading from the prophet 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 15 in the New International Version. Now when springtime came around again, the anniversary of the Ammonite aggression, David dispatched Joab and his fighting men of Israel in full force to destroy the Ammonites for good. They laid siege to Rabbah, but David stayed in Jerusalem. One late afternoon, David got up from taking his nap, and he was strolling on the roof of his palace. And from this vantage point on the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was stunningly beautiful. David sent to ask about her and was told, "Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David sent his agents to her. After she arrived, he went to bed with her. And this occurred during the time of purification following her period. Then she returned home. Before long, she realized that she was pregnant, and she sent word to David, "I'm pregnant." David then got in touch with Joab. "Send Uriah the Hittite to me." Joab sent him. When Uriah arrived, David asked him for news on the front. How are things going with Joab and the troops and with the fighting? And then he said to Uriah, "Go home, have a refreshing bath and a good night's rest." After Uriah left the palace, an informant of the king was sent after him. But Uriah did not go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance along with the king's servants. David was told that Uriah had not gone home. He asked Uriah, "Didn't you just come off of a hard trip? So why didn't you go home?" Uriah replied to David, "The chest is out there with the fighting men of Israel and Judah in tents. My master Joab and his servants are roughing it out in the fields. So how can I go home and eat and drink and enjoy my life? On your life, I will not do it." "All right," said David, "have it your way. Stay for the day, and I'll send you back tomorrow." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem the rest of the day. The next day, David invited him to eat and drink with him, and David got him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah again went out and slept with his master's servants. He did not go home. So in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In the letter, he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front lines where the fighting is fiercest, and then pull back and leave him exposed so that he's sure to be killed." So ends our reading. I remember learning that Bathsheba tempted King David, causing him to sin, and basically it was her fault. How many of you learned that version the first time? A couple of, yeah. And I carried that belief until I started seeing the world and myself and others and God differently. And because of that, started reading the Bible differently, reading it from an evolving perspective, which became especially curious about those whose voices and whose stories were missing. And the picture became clearer to me. In this story, Bathsheba's voice was missing. We hear David's voice. We even hear Uriah's voice, but never her voice. So here's my imagining of Bathsheba telling her own story. I am Queen Bathsheba, and David is my king. And I have never told this story to anyone before. It was springtime. My husband Uriah had been sent into battle with Joab. As usual, I'd been bathing on the roof of our house. Afterwards, a messenger from King David came to our door. I was so afraid that it was bad news about Uriah. But no, it was someone coming to bring me to the palace. So I was taken before the king. And he said to me, "You are very beautiful, and I would like to have sex with you." I was afraid. I was married. I loved my husband, and I was purifying myself. I did not want to have sex with the king. But what choice did I have? He was the king. And after it was done, they sent me home. A month later, I realized that I was pregnant. I sent word to King David, but heard nothing in response. I didn't know what to do. I was ashamed. A few months later, another messenger came, this time with the news that I had feared for so long. My husband Uriah had been killed in battle. I was devastated. He was my true love. He was my rock. And now he was dead. He was gone. I was alone and pregnant with the king's baby. What was I to do? A few weeks later, the king's messenger came again and summoned me to the palace. This time, David said that he would make me his wife. I was shocked. But again, I had no choice. I bore him a son. And I still believe that somehow my son and I would be taken care of. But only later I learned the horrible truth that when David learned that I was pregnant by him, he tried to cover it up. And he ultimately sent my beloved husband to the front lines of the battles to ensure that he would be killed. Things got worse. Months later, my son became deathly ill. David begged God to spare the boy, but my son died. I was distraught, and so was David. He blamed himself, and I blamed him too, because what he did was wrong. What he did was evil. But through it all, no one ever asked me how I felt, or what I thought, or what I wanted. And so I invite you to take a moment in quiet to pray. Just remember your own experience and keep on breathing just for a moment or two. until that we need not be ashamed if we know this story and that we are not alone. In 2006, the Me Too, the hashtag Me Too movement began when Tarana Burke sought to unite with other women of color who were survivors of sexual assault. In 2017, if you remember, the Me Too movement went viral when one actress after another came forward to accuse Harvey Weinstein of harassment, abuse, and rape. The movement grew exponentially as women from every walk of life have responded, Me Too. The major impact of this movement has been to give voice to survivors whose stories, whose voices have not been heard, to hear them and to believe them and to stop blaming them. And the numbers who have come forward is astonishing because every institution is infected with the same problem that was so exemplified by King David. Powerful men abusing less powerful, abusing them for years and protected by the very institutions they are working within. Today's list, King David list, is large and growing. Roger Ailes, Harvey Weinstein, Bill O'Reilly, Bill Cosby, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Roy Moore, Larry Nassar, and so many others. But Bathsheba's story is not the end of David's story. There is a part 2 where God enters in. God sends the prophet Nathan to confront David. And Nathan does so in a parable. He says, there were 2 men in a city. One was rich and one was poor. And the rich man had many, many sheep. The poor man had only one lamb, which he had raised within his family and loved as a child. The guest came to visit the rich man, and rather than take a sheep from his own flocks, he took the poor man's lamb and served it for dinner. And David is livid in response to this story. He says, the man who has done these things deserves to die. He should restore the lamb fourfold because he had no pity. Nathan reveals God's judgment to him, saying, David, you are the man. I have given you everything. You murdered Uriah and took his wife. I will take your wives and cause you trouble, and your child will die. Consequences. And finally, we're seeing consequences for some of the rich and powerful and entitled men who have preyed so long on powerless people. In addition to consequences, we need other stories, other hidden histories that we didn't learn about in Sunday school, including the story of Queen Vashti. I don't know how many of you know her story. She appears in the book of Esther. She's the queen right before Esther. Again, in the biblical text, we never hear her story, her voice, or her story, but we can imagine it. So I want us to hear Queen Vashti tell her own story. So here's Queen Vashti. I was Queen Vashti, wife of King Ahasuerus. And in those days, the king was very rich, and he ruled over all the land from Ethiopia to India. The king gave a banquet for all the men of the court. It was lavish. There were fine linens covering everything. There were gold and silver couches, gorgeous mosaic floors, wine flowing freely, a no-host bar with no limit. This wild frat party went on for a week. And I actually gave a party of my own for all the women in the court. We had a lovely time swimming, relaxing, having massage, having our nails polished. But on the seventh day, my drunken king, sent for me. He said I should come before him, wearing my crown and parading myself in front of his cronies. He thought that I was very beautiful, and he wanted to show me off to them. I considered his request for a moment and sent word back. No. I expected this would anger him, and it did. But I refused to be leered at by the king's drunken friends. I heard that the king consulted his lawyers. What should I do now that the queen has said no? No to a king. There was much wringing of hands among the lawyers. What if other women say no to their kings or to their husbands? What would happen to the world? So basically, I was fired. I was relieved of my duties as queen and never again had to appear before that king. What a relief. But to protect the status quo, the king sent out word that all women should obey the king and their husbands. But it was too late. Word had already spread through the grapevine that I had said no to the king and had lived to tell about it. So I live my life quietly now, far away from the drama of the king's court. I'm happy. And I hear that the king has a new queen, Esther. I wish her well, but I do not envy her. So that was Queen Esther. Queen Vashti, who said no to her king. And she lost her job as queen, and she was okay. But saying no to someone who has power over you can have major negative consequences. It can end a career or a job or result in other forms of retaliation. From my own personal experience, I know how scary it can be to say no and how important allies are. And I also know that for a single mom with 3 children, this may not be an option. Like Bathsheba, this woman may have no other choice. But more and more women are finding their voice, finding allies, finding their power to say no to those who have demanded their submission. Jesus reminds us to pray always and to never lose heart, to persist in the pursuit of justice. In his parable that I love of the persistent widow, Jesus describes a woman who goes to the unjust judge, asking, demanding to be vindicated. Perhaps she's a Me Too woman. But the judge doesn't really care. He can't be bothered. He sends her away. She returns. He sends her away again. She returns, and finally the judge says, all right, I will vindicate you if you will just stop bothering me. Vindication. The word means to be set free. She asks to be set free from the wounds that she bears, the stigma of being a victim, the stigma of it being her fault. She asks to be heard and to be believed by someone with power in the public square, by a judge. She asks to be restored to her community, where she was not heard or believed and was blamed for what she'd done, when in fact it was what was done to her. She is asking for justice. And so may we, all of us, hear the voices of all those longing to be heard, believed, healed, liberated from shame, and vindicated, including ourselves. And may justice healing, and peace roll forth like a mighty river. And may it begin with us.